When it was founded, Everglades National Park did something that no other park had ever done before. The National Park Service writes, "With the dedication of Everglades National Park in 1947, a new precedent was set in the growing conservation movement. For the first time in American history, a large tract of wilderness was permanently protected, not for its scenic value, but for the benefit of the unique diversity of life it sustained." We didn't decide to protect the Everglades because of its beauty, although it is beautiful there. Instead, we saw the incredible value in the fragile, unique life that existed there, and we wanted to protect it. With the passage of time, Everglades has only become more important, and today it holds both nationally and internationally treasured resources. But what about the Everglades is so special? What is it about these resources that's so important? Well, as it turns out, Everglades isn't just one giant area of the same thing, like the same plants and the same animals. To the contrary, there are actually 8 different worlds within the park, 8 different ecosystems, each with their own plants, their own animals, and their own story to tell. The National Park Service calls these 8 worlds a mosaic because they each hold such a different and diverse array of life. And some of this life can be found nowhere else in the entire world. Alright, so let's go ahead and get into today's tour. For starters, the Everglades has the largest mangrove forest in the entire northern hemisphere. That's a weird flex, but it's still a flex. Now, for some reason, when I hear the word mangrove, I think of a giant, hairy-looking Sasquatch creature. I don't really know why, that's just how my brain works. It has nothing to do with what a mangrove actually is. Mangroves, in fact, are pretty unique trees, resilient little guys with the ability to survive and thrive in conditions that would normally kill a plant. Their home is loose, wet soil, and awfully salty because they live right where the ocean meets land. This means that when the tide comes in, it floods the mangrove forest. But don't worry about the mangroves because they have adapted to this different way of life. They have these, honestly pretty sick, unique roots that look like giant stilts. And these roots help them stay upright and weather the constant changes in water levels. They even have, wait for it, a built-in filtration system that helps them filter out the salt. And spoiler alert, it's a good thing that mangroves are so resilient because they're actually critical to the survival of many species on this earth and of the planet itself. So they're kind of a big deal. For one thing, there are several animals and fish that only live in mangrove forests. And the mangrove trees have a particularly strong ability to soak up carbon from the air. This makes them a key player in the mission to keep our air clean. Mangroves even provide the first line of defense during hurricanes. It's these forests that bear the brunt of the winds and waves, and it's these forests that act as natural barriers to protect us from the worst of these storms. Honestly, I found these trees absolutely amazing while I was learning about them, and I'm actually surprised that nobody has ever made a bumper sticker that just says, "Thank a mangrove" on it, because these trees really do a lot for us. But we can't stay on mangroves for too long because they are only one out of the 8 worlds today. 8 worlds today? 8. Yes, only one out of the 8 worlds today that we are going to cover. So let's move to our second world. For this world, let's go somewhere a bit drier, to the tropical hardwood hammock ecosystem. These areas of the park are the highest in elevation, making them the driest parts of the park. Now, driest is relative because, let's be honest, nothing is really dry in southern Florida. I mean, I feel like I can just wash my hands by moving them around in the air. But compared to the other habitats in the Everglades, the tropical hardwood hammock is dry. It's considered dry because it is the only part of the Everglades that doesn't usually flood. This area is called tropical because, well, it's in the tropics, hardwood because of the types of trees that exist here, like broadleaf oak trees. Why this habitat has the name hammock is perhaps a little less obvious. To understand this, think of an actual hammock that we hang up. This is something that we hang high in the air, and natural tree hammocks are also high up, relatively. And let's be honest here, I hang my hammock like 2 feet off the ground because it's already hard enough to get into. I can't imagine having to like fully climb into it. It's just not gonna happen. The massive, tall trees that live here create a dense canopy that provides much needed shade to animals in the area who are seeking refuge from the heat, including the endangered Florida panther. And here's something super cool about the hardwood hammock. They have a built-in firewall. Hardwood hammocks are like little islands of trees popping up around the Everglades. The trees inside these hammocks usually do not like fire and would normally be very susceptible to it. Unfortunately for them, they're situated among many other ecosystems that love fire, which is slightly problematic for them. In other words, the ecosystems that surround the hardwood hammock are actually fire dependent. They need and love fire. Talk about having some bad neighbors. Normally, this would be pretty bad news from a hardwood hammock because all the fires from the other ecosystems would come in and ravage that area. But fortunately, they've got it covered. Acids from decaying plants in the hardwood hammock run off to the ends of the islands, eating away at the bedrock and essentially creating a little moat that surrounds the area. Because of this, normally when there's a fire, it'll come right up to the moat, but it can't go over it. So, moral of the story here is, if your neighbors are bothering you, just build a moat. Now, it's strange to think about an ecosystem that's so humid and wet also being dependent on fire. So now let's move to one of these unique habitats. These are the pine rocklands, a forest of pine trees, but one with hardly any soil. Now you might be asking, Dina, don't plants need soil to grow? Well, yes, you would be right in most cases, except psych! The plants of the pine rocklands are built different. The plants here manage to live with relatively small amounts of soil, and they take root in the exposed limestone that's in the area. Now, what's really interesting about the pine rocklands is that this rather unique living situation doesn't stop diversity from growing here. In fact, the rocklands are both the most plant diverse and most endangered part of the Everglades. Only about 2% of the original rocklands still stand. Now you might be asking, why is there so little still standing? And the answer is that, much like the hardwood hammock, the pine rocklands are relatively dry. And for us humans who live in southern Florida, they make the perfect environment for our homes and agriculture. So much of that forest has been torn away for human development, which is not ideal. But let's get back to the fire. These forests, as I said, love fire, and in fact, they are actually dependent on it for their survival. The pines that grow here don't provide nearly as much shade as the hardwood hammock trees do, and the abundant sunlight in the area is exactly what allows the unique diversity there to thrive. The hardwood hammock trees do try to invade the area too, let's be honest. Nobody's really a good neighbor in this scenario. And if the hardwood hammock trees were to grow in the pine rocklands, they would eventually grow tall enough and create a canopy of shade. Well, like I said, the plants in the pine rocklands are incredibly dependent on abundant sunlight, so having a bunch of new shade in the area is going to end up killing these plants. In other words, if the hardwood hammock trees grew here, they'd eventually block out the sun and significantly alter the ecosystem. But fires keep this from happening. It destroys the growing hardwood hammock trees because, as we said, they are not fire resistant, and keeps the area as a pine rockland. To simplify it, in other words, fires keep the pine rocklands from becoming a hardwood hammock. Alright, so that's the first three ecosystems. Now let's return to the flooded wetlands. What's really interesting is that very small differences in elevation cause a huge difference in the ecosystem that exists there. For example, the difference between the relatively dry pine rockland we just talked about and the next, much wetter ecosystem is less than 20 feet. This is the freshwater slough. The slough is actually the wettest part of the Everglades, except for, the part that's actually ocean, because obviously that has the most water. The slough plays a pivotal role in making the Everglades possible because it is what channels water through the park. The sloughs move water from more mainland Florida down the land into the ocean, and they are also the only area that remains flooded almost year-round. Every year during the wet season, water floods the sloughs and a few other habitats and brings life to all these places. But during the dry season, these other areas dry out and leave the slough as the only body of water. It's during the dry season that the sloughs act as a critical water source for all the animals in the area, like alligators or birds like egrets and herons, and tons of fish. These sloughs all serve as a type of refuge for animals so that they can survive the dry season. Eventually, each and every year, the wet season returns and the other areas in the park become flooded again. Then these animals pack up their bags and move back out to the newfound flooded areas. This ebb and flow of the water levels is a critical part of what makes the Everglades possible, and without the sloughs keeping all the water in during the dry season, none of the magic of the Everglades would be able to happen. Things would just kind of ebb instead of ebb and flow because the water would go away and then all the animals would die and the plants would die, and it would just kind of be a major bummer. So the sloughs are critically important to keeping the Everglades alive. Now, bordering the sloughs is a slightly drier habitat called the freshwater marl prairie. These areas are home to the critically important periphyton. I think that's how you say that. Periphyton is a mixture of algae, bacteria, and detritus that attaches to surfaces underwater. Tiny animals eat it, like invertebrates, tadpoles, and some fish. And in this way, periphyton acts as the bottom of the food chain in the Everglades. Which, as you probably know, being at the bottom of the food chain is an unfortunate role to play, but it is also a critical role to play because you are the foundation that all other life is able to grow off of. The marl prairie is similar to freshwater sloughs in many aspects, including the fact that they are both full of sawgrass. And sawgrass is this rather interesting looking type of grass that literally looks like a saw. It has ridges and teeth. And sawgrass is actually what the Everglades is mostly named after because there is so much of it that when you stand in these areas, the grass just seems to go on forever and ever. Everglades. Yeah, it makes sense. The grass is a characteristic part of the marl prairie and sloughs, and these ecosystems are also maintained by fire. The fire basically sweeps these areas too and kind of skims the top and burns the trees and plants that don't belong there. Speaking of trees, let's move on to another fascinating tree. Remember the mangroves? Well, let's talk about cypress trees. And if the mangroves are a hairy, Sasquatch-looking creature, I feel like the cypress trees would be a goddess. I don't know, this is how my brain works. I don't have anything else to say. That just makes sense to me. While not quite as resilient as the mangroves, the cypress trees are fascinating in their own way. They grow in pools of water, particularly pools that are formed in a rather interesting way. All around Everglades National Park are something called solution holes, also known as depressions in the ground. They form when decaying vegetation releases acids, and these acids eat away at the limestone beneath the Everglades. The solution holes act as little pools of water that stick around even as things dry up, and they also act as the perfect place for cypress trees to grow. When cypress trees grow in a solution hole, they form like a big dome shape. The reason for this is because the tallest tree grows in the middle of the hole, where there's the most water and nutrients. As the trees reach the edges of the pool, there's less water and nutrients, so they become shorter, and altogether they form a dome. And fun fact, cypress trees have little formation called cypress knees. Cypress trees, cypress knees, that rhymes. Cypress knees are part of the roots that jut up out of the water, and we aren't actually sure what they're for. One theory is that they transport oxygen from the air to the submerged roots, which I thought was pretty darn cool. Alright, our next habitat is called the coastal lowlands. Much like the mangroves help border the area where fresh water meets ocean, so does the coastal lowlands. These areas are full of succulents and other low-growing plants that have adapted to be resilient against the saltwater and high winds that occur on the coast. And finally, we come to the last ecosystem on our list, the marine areas. In other words, the ocean. The sloughs empty out their fresh water into Florida Bay, and here we have over 800 miles of marine bottom where seagrass, algae, and many fish live. Florida Bay is also home to tons and tons of alligators, so it's definitely not the best place for your next beach vacation. Alright, we just covered a stupid amount of information, so let's recap real quick. Like I mentioned earlier, small changes in altitude lead to big differences in environment in Everglades National Park. The highest and driest areas are the hardwood hammock and the pine rockland. Then we get into the wetter areas like the marl prairie and the sloughs. We also have cypress domes interspersed throughout the park, and this will be wherever there's a depression large enough to pool lots of water. Closer to sea level, we have the mangroves and the coastal lowlands, and finally, we reach the ocean at Florida Bay. And there you have it, the 8 worlds of Everglades National Park. If you liked this video, please go ahead and leave a like down below. Seriously, a lot of research went into this video, so I would really appreciate that. And if you extra enjoyed it, be sure to hit that subscribe button so that I can see you in the next one.